Welcome everybody to the Ontario Near monthly webinar series, and thank you, Clay, for that beautiful opening, starting us off in a good way. And welcome, Brenda, and thank you for being here to present for us once again. So, for anybody who doesn't know me, my name is Michael Brown. I work with the Ontario Near and Wakapiness. I'm a research officer there and a cultural and spiritual events coordinator. And I am also the ceremonial and I guess academic Ashkabewis as well. And I love my work and I'm really glad to be here. So welcome, welcome. Once again, thank you, Clay, for that opening. And just to remind the audience of a few housekeeping items, this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel. And we would like to encourage anybody listening right now or viewing right now to share that with their networks. We would also like to ask attendees to ask questions through the question and answer the Q&A feature of this webinar Zoom, as the verbal and video participation will be unavailable. There will be also a short survey that will pop up automatically at the end of this webinar. So please take your time to fill that out so we can improve for the future. And so with that, I would like to bring our attention over to Brenda Restoule, who will be giving us a presentation on the First Nations mental wellness workforce, a realist review. I've heard many things. I'm very excited.
Miigwech, Clay, for the prayer and the reminders of, being thankful for all that we have at this time, for being silent and reflective and being ready to move into spring and bringing new growth and all that this time of year brings to us. And thank you, Michael, for the introduction. I'm really happy to join you once again. Ani Bojo, Wapsakwastijnakas, Magizi Dodem, Kikan Donjaba, Anishinaabe and Dao, Debendigo Saking. My spirit name is Little Swan Woman. I'm from the Eagle Clan. I am a proud member of Dokis First Nation, or Kikendot, Nishnabek, which is located on the French River. And I come to you today from the traditional territories of the Nabizing Nishnabek people, which is across the lake from my own beautiful home community where I live and work and play with my husband and children in Nipissing First Nation. So in the Robinson Huron Treaty, and I'm in Northern Ontario. So I'm really appreciative for the opportunity that the NEAR gives us to do research and also to make presentations about the work that we're doing. And as a community organization, I'm the Chief Executive Officer of First Peoples Wellness Circle, and I'll talk a little bit about who we are. But I'm quite excited to chat about this work that is partially funded by the NEAR. And so for those of you who may not know, a realist review is another method of studying complex interventions in response to perceived limitations around conventional systemic review methodologies. So it means that we're going to talk today a little bit about context and mechanisms and outcomes to help explain differences as well as intended and unintended differences. And generally, the realist review is meant to answer the question about what works for whom and under what circumstances, so that we can look at things like unpacking the impacts of complex interventions and looking at it works, see how it works on the premise that one needs to understand how interventions work in different contexts and why. So the intention really of doing this work is to begin to look at some recommendations for policy changes around the First Nations mental wellness workforce. So I just respectfully acknowledge that all of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who are stewards of the land for where each of us live, play, and work. And as I noted earlier, First Peoples Wellness Circle head office as a remote organization is located on the unceded traditional territory and lands of the Nabizing, Nishnabek, or Nipissing First Nations people. So a little bit about us. We are a national not-for-profit corporation. We are governed and managed by Indigenous leaders, primarily First Nations leaders, but we do have some Métis representation on our board as well. We strive for regional representation across the country, and we currently have a few vacancies on our board. So if there's any interest in working with us, I'd love to hear from you. And we can certainly talk about the vacancies and what we're looking for in a board member. But our mandate comes from the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework. Sometimes I just refer to it as the framework. And that framework was established 10 years ago. So this is our anniversary this year of the launch of the framework, which was built off of over 600 voices of First Nations people working in mental wellness and other similar areas in the social determinants of health around wellness, to create a framework that can help us in talking about mental wellness, help us in the planning, delivery, and implementation of wellness programs and services, but most importantly, to help us in creating a pathway for systems change so that mental wellness that is created from the lens of First Nations people. So that systems change would include policy changes. And that's part of what this work is attempting to do, is build on the making changes to understanding our workforce and how they deliver wellness services. Our intention is really to strive to create systems change, as I mentioned, and using Indigenous knowledge and evidence, primarily First Nations knowledge and evidence, to ensure that there's equitable investments for First Nations mental wellness programs and services, whether that be in mental health and addictions, or it be in housing or emergency management or education, wherever we find the need to ensure well-being and wellness. This is where we're advocating and looking for policy and systems change around equitable investments at the workforce level, at the program level, and in all places in between. A little bit about our strategic directions. We don't use the words vision and mission and objectives, but rather as part of the framework, we note that the outcomes of mental wellness are hope, belonging, meaning, and purpose. And we have built that directly into our strategic directions. And so our purpose, as you can see, is to walk with and support First Peoples, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, and their communities to share collective intelligence for healing, peacemaking, and to live a good life by recognizing we hold the knowledge and the wisdom and the practices to living a good life. And we also hold those same practices for our own healing, but also the healing of all of our brothers and sisters, including our mother, the earth, and peacemaking in times where colonial violence has been harmful to us and to many other populations. And then we have our meaning about making sure that we have a nation where First Peoples and our communities can experience holistic health and wellness by living through our own cultural values, beliefs, and practices. And our hope is to advocate for that collaborative, transformative change for wellness and whole health for our people. And we do have a belonging, which is our shared values, which I don't have listed here, but all of that can be found on our website if you're so interested to learn more. And so this work that I'm going to do, I wanted to start by just acknowledging our contributors and who supported us. And so you see the NEAR is one of our main contributors for this work, but we also have a MyTax grant around the Realist review, and that has been accessed through Western University. And our partners at Western University are our primary partners, and that includes Dr. Victoria Smyth and Ryan Chan, who are leading the work through Western University. And then we have Maura McPhee at UBC, who is a expert in the area of realist review and is really guiding our work on this. And then we had an intern through Concordia University, Mel Lefebvre, who assisted us in analyzing all of our information. And then our community partners have also included Thunderbird Partnership Foundation with Dr. Carol Hopkins, and First Nations Health Managers Association with Judith Eganbrug and her team, as well as Healthcare Excellence Canada, excuse me, a, a pan-Canadian health organization who is also supporting this work. Just wanted to note all of those folks, including those in our teams who are assisting and supporting us. So the reason we took up this work was an acknowledgement of a few things. We know that the pandemic highlighted the challenges around mental wellness that we have in our communities. There's a lot of information that shows it highlighted and exacerbated the existing challenges in our community that we're still dealing with to this day, with increased homelessness, increased substance use, and mental wellness challenges that our people in both the rural and urban settings are bringing forward to various service organizations. But we also know that we have suffered from a disproportionate number of mental health concerns for quite some time. And listed here, we have things, of course, like depression and suicide, completions and attempts, addictions of all kinds, and other serious mental illnesses. And a lot of these disparities and inequities, both within the mental health and addictions area, as well as health services overall, we know are a result of colonialism and those policies that come from colonialism, as well as the impacts and consequences of colonial violence that we've experienced that have led to things like intergenerational trauma. And so recognizing that all of this is the case, we know that our workforce are working very, very hard. They're working hard to bring wellness to their communities. They're addressing complex and complicated issues within our communities, and considering needing to understand the wellness of the workforce and how do we build a workforce that can meet these complexities and needs are critical. And so this Realist review is about looking to understand more about the workforce and what are some of their needs, their priorities, but more importantly, how do we invest in those needs and priorities in equitable ways. So we have, as I stated earlier, the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework was one of those frameworks that helped lead us or guide us in thinking about the complexities of mental wellness challenges in the communities, or in our nations, I should say. But it also leads and guides us in thinking about where we need investments and what the priority needs are. And so in an assessment that was done through First People's Wellness Circle, we had identified in a select portion of a mental wellness workforce known as mental wellness teams. They identified at that time in 2019 that there was a need for growing a highly qualified mental wellness workforce to attend to those complexities and the challenges that exist. And so we felt that there needed to be further exploration and identification of evidence that already exists in the literature to inform the development and implementation of a sustainable and culturally appropriate and trauma and violence informed workforce here in Canada. And so that's what this work will focus on at this time. So our objectives really with the Realist review was to conduct and use the whole methodology of a Realist review to understand and examine current literature and invite opinions on the development, implementation, and sustainability of a mental wellness workforce in First Nations from coast to coast to coast. So really we are taking existing literature, finding out what the literature is telling us, and then taking it back to the people who have sort of firsthand knowledge of the workforce and asking them, is this getting it right? Are there things that aren't being identified here that we need to consider? What else do we need to know? Where else do we need to look? And what other information do we need to collect? So it's really building upon itself to understand this information and help create sort of a very holistic picture. So we had three main research questions. The first was understanding the models of education. So we wanted to know what models of education are most effective in recruiting, supporting, and retaining First Nations mental health and wellness workers within their communities. So we wanted to understand that. And we just held a roundtable and heard from some graduate students about the challenges about working in graduate programs and feeling isolated for a variety of reasons. And so we wanted to learn a little bit about that in more detail. We also wanted to know what and how do these models of education work in terms of how do they work to support the mental wellness workforce. And the third question we had is what's needed to support a First Nations mental wellness workforce, whether that be from a training and capacity perspective or in terms of ensuring their abilities and capabilities to do the work, knowing that they're often burdened with a high level of demand and expectation to meet a significant number of needs in our nations. And so our methodology consisted of a few things. You'll see to the right, the diagram in terms of the different steps we took. So part of it was actually doing what we call this realist synthesis or realist review. So it was really looking at the literature. And Pawson in 2005 can give some information, as I was saying earlier, about what is a realist synthesis. As I noted, it is really the method for studying those complex interventions in response to perceived limitations around conventional forms of systematic review methodologies. We also did then an iterative process, which was consulting and engaging with community partners to hear if the information we collected was relevant. We also did a consultation with a research librarian to get more information about whether we were accessing all of the information we could. And then we also reviewed this as a research team through our meetings. And we had a search criteria. So we were looking at anything that pulled up around Indigenous, mental wellness, workforce and education. And we kept that information within 3 areas, looking at Canada, the US, and Australia between 2007 and 2023 through a variety of sources that you note here. So we really were looking in step 1 to locate our theories and understand the search process and the theories that we wanted to examine, and then searching for evidence with the librarian around pilot searching and refining and screening, and then going to article selection, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then if necessary, we would go back to the librarian around the article selection. And when we were done that, we would go to extraction and organizing data, and back then through a search if necessary, and did that loop process till we felt comfortable that we had accessed all the information we needed, and went then to synthesizing the data around those 3 themes of context, mechanisms, and outcomes, and then looked at refining the synthesis. So refining our theories, potentially doing additional searches as needed, which is kind of where we are right now and thinking about our next steps, and probably going back into a step 2, and I'll get to that at the end of my presentation. So what did our results show? Our results showed that we looked through a number of databases and pulled out a large number of potential articles that we could review, over 700 articles. And then we took that and we looked to see, we removed any references that were duplicates. And then we put it back in and we did a screen to see what was remaining. And we excluded any studies that did not match what we were looking for. Then we went back through and did a retrieval, pulled anything out from there, and then looked at eligible studies that we wanted to explore further. So we got ourselves down to 72 and excluded 46 of those studies because they were the wrong population or the wrong study design or the wrong setting. And then in the end studied and reviewed 26 articles that looked at the workforce and the well-being of the workforce. So our primary analysis in terms of the emerging themes that we found was, the first was around connection to culture and community. The second was around clinical and cultural supervision and mentorship. 3, collaboration and partnerships, both internal and external. And the fourth was leadership models and implications. And I'll talk about each of these in my slides. In the first one, the first thing we did was look at context, mechanisms, and outcome statements or hypotheses. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with realist reviews, and that's been me, and so this is my first foray into talking about it, hopefully with a little bit of confidence, is we really wanted to look at the contextual factors or those circumstances that influence the outcomes for a workforce and their success in sort of delivering programs and services. The second area that we wanted to look at through our analysis was in the area of mechanisms, so wanting to understand processes and structures in those contexts to be able to understand the outcomes of interest that we wanted to explore around the well-being and the equity of the workforce. So that included looking at cognitive and emotional reasoning in those mechanisms. And lastly, in the area of outcomes, we wanted to understand both intended and unintended outcomes, as well as short, medium, and long-term outcomes, and any varying outcomes that might be of importance to the particular group, in this case, First Nations or First Nations mental wellness workforce. And that's all sort of highlighted in the work done by Pawson and Wong and others. So our first was in the area, so our statements around context mechanisms and outcomes hypotheses is in the area of culture and community. We have quite a few here. The first was the importance of having culture in the workplace or in the work that you do. And so we found through our analysis, our synthesis of the information is that when community-based mental health education programs and services, or mental wellness programs and services, are grounded in the local culture, the local First Nations, Inuit, Métis culture, and there's engagement by service providers and the community, they're far more likely to provide culturally relevant and holistic interventions because the cultural expertise, knowledge, and values are valued and are seen as foundational to the work within the community around mental wellness or mental health care, as it's noted here. So the first was recognizing that the value of Indigenous culture at a local context and how it creates the foundation and the lens or the paradigm in which the work is done because it is valued. The second thing that we understood from the synthesis of the work was the mental wellness workforce in our communities, that includes both Indigenous and non-Indigenous staff, that the workplace itself must engage in and have practices around culturally safe practices. So they have to be in place and present and available for the workforce, because with that, it allows for the workspaces to feel safe and allows for greater likelihood of recruitment and retention of the staff, and ultimately generates trust amongst the individuals they're serving, so the clients, because there is that ongoing respect for Indigenous cultural ways of being and doing. So having a safe workplace that not only says they provide culturally safe services and delivers cultural programs, also is actually walking its talk and creating safety for both the workforce and those that they service. And so the last quote here is really something that comes from our synthesis that supports our hypotheses. So you see here from Bailey, it does say that participants emphasize that the valuable knowledge and skill sets of Indigenous people and what they bring to the health service is very critical. And it's not just formal qualifications and skills, but rather it's about that ongoing motivation and desire by our people in the workforce to make a difference in their communities, which was so beautifully said by Clay in his prayer, and bringing value and recognizing its value for them, for the workforce and for those that they're serving, because often it's been undervalued, and as a result of it being undervalued, underutilized in terms of our cultural values, expertise, knowledge, and evidence. And so therefore we aren't acknowledging and recognizing the importance of things like community connections and how we go about doing our work in communities or nations, which can look quite different. The other hypothesis we had was around culture and education. In this area, we noted that any Indigenous student who attends Western-based mental health education programs away from their communities, the program structure has to have a few key components for it to be successful in the training of a workforce. The first is to be able to provide adequate time away from the program for a student to be able to connect back to their community, so that they need to be able to connect back to their community, because there is value in a student being able to maintain and sustain their community connections and support, which increases their own connection to their cultural knowledge and evidence, but it also sustains their well-being. And so an article from 2007 shows very much that what we have found in the hypotheses, that when students have access to time-honored traditional practices, communities, they appear to have a significant source of support for students. And so programs really need to consider structuring their academic, sequencing our programming in ways that allow for the student to have time away to attend to ceremonies, traditional celebrations, revisiting home communities, and that programs need to consider adjusting their policies related to funding to allow students to acquire higher stipends so that they can support returning to their community as a way to pursue higher education and retain students in Western-based training programs. The third area of hypothesis we had was in the area of what we called survivance and surveillance. We recognize that there are ongoing and insidious colonial practices that exist within Western-based psychology training programs. And as a result, Indigenous students who are studying mental wellness or mental health are at a greater risk for negative stereotyping and expected failure. And this is often due to those colonial beliefs and attitudes that often put them at a greater risk of dismissal and devaluing them within the Western academic system. So dismissing and devaluating them as a person, but also the values they bring, their beliefs and their practices, and knowledge and evidence. And so all of those contribute to the likelihood of failure or difficulty for our people to continue to remain in these systems or to even be recruited in them. So as described in the theme around surveillance, participants experience policing around things like their identity, their sacred traditions, their ways of being, their ontologies that were forcibly revealed, devalued, and dismissed by the programs in which they were studying under. And often they were dismissed as being insufficient and inappropriate for the success of the field of psychology. But as Irani suggests, that the manner of policing does not prevent participants from mobilizing mechanisms around survivance to be able to navigate such stressors so that they could move through the program while maintaining a sense of cultural integrity. And we heard about that from some of our grad students in our roundtable that we had a few weeks ago, who said that the very thing that, you know, when they challenged some negative stereotypes through their program, they were often targeted, which caused them to feel a sense of isolation, but their connection to either other Indigenous students or Indigenous scholars or back to their community and their elders helped them to kind of survive and get through the program, recognizing that there's far more greater importance in the work they're going to do back in community, that and they need to get through a Western system, training system, in order to come to community and deliver something that's valued and appropriate for our nations. In the next one around clinical and cultural areas around mentorship, we had a couple of hypotheses. And the first hypothesis was around the Indigenous mental wellness staff or mental health staff. We noted that when they receive dedicated clinical and cultural supervision from an experienced mentor who is Indigenous themselves, with the appropriate clinical and cultural skills, the likelihood of emotional exhaustion is diminished significantly and increases job retention because there is a greater investment in the individual and their clinical and cultural skills and knowledge, which increases their confidence, so creates greater self-confidence and enhances their positive coping to deal with the high levels of stress that they experience in the workplace. So we have two quotes here that support that. The first is having access to clinical and cultural supervision. Clinical supervision is seen as having a good supervisor that can enable the factors, but clinical supervision was reported to minimize emotional exhaustion and turnover and to result in staff feeling supported to participate in professional development. With the presence of an Indigenous supervisor and a supportive management structure, it is seen as far more welcoming and safe working environment. Ella in 2014 found similar things, opportunities for clinical and cultural mentoring of workers that's distinct from support from direct frontline managers could address things like worker stress. So cultural awareness training for managers and other staff could also strengthen understanding the workplace around the role of Indigenous workers. In the area of collaboration and partnership, both internal and external, we had one main hypothesis. In this one, we are talking here about the strategic coordination and collaboration amongst Indigenous communities with non-Indigenous sectors and governments. If it is done in culturally safe ways that does develop comprehensive continuum of mental wellness services, it's far more likely to evolve. So when we collaborate between the two to create these culturally safe and comprehensive continuum of services, it was more likely to evolve because there's greater clarity and there's greater commitment to the end goal of the creation of that mental wellness service that specifically meets the needs of the local community and meets their goals and priorities. And so where the information we found comes from our own work that we did in 2019, where we noted that the challenge of collaborating with provincial entities is exacerbated by those jurisdictional issues we experience for on-reserve programs. So is it a federal or a provincial program? And that the services that aren't provided on reserve. So institution and partners may hold attitudes that are culturally unsafe and even systemically racist. So assuming that Western and mainstream approaches are the only solution. So when that happens, it makes it more difficult to move forward our own goals and priorities. And then in the area of leadership and leadership models and leadership implications, we have the following hypothesis. So it's a proposed leadership model. Here, when we have mental wellness staff and leaders, and they are recruited and trained within our communities, individuals are far more likely to stay. So that leads to a greater retainment. And they also report that they have greater satisfaction with their work due to the greater sense of meaningfulness and the type of work they give, and to that notion of giving back to the communities. Again, all of what Clay shared in his prayer. So I feel like there was a lot of connection here, Clay, between you and I and what we're talking about today. So here's two quotes from the work that we did. The first is around the leaders designing and running their own health programs and being able to supervise them in a particular community, whether it was community-based workers or non-Indigenous staff. In many ways, when the people that are Indigenous are appointed to the leadership roles within their communities, there's greater success. And the second one is when we have trainees working in a workplace with no or few other Aboriginal workers, they often feel that and express feeling culturally isolated, which creates a lot of challenges. And so they talk about feeling most challenged about just working in this role with no other allies around them in terms of familiar people who hold similar values and cultural beliefs. And so trainees who have varied experience and knowledge of the local Indigenous community can be challenging, and it means that we have to be able to bring trainees to those local communities and have them come from other communities and regions so that they can learn how to work with the local communities or nations and ensure that they're working from those cultural protocols that are recognized. So what's our next steps? You see that our themes around the CMO hypotheses and statements, we have them, but we're continuing to look at how they emerge. We are doing ongoing data analysis and having more team meetings. We want to apply a strength-based approach to the ongoing work in our analysis and synthesis. And so in our team meetings, we're talking about what else do we need to know, where else do we need to go for information, who else do we need to talk to help create that strength-based approach to our analysis and synthesis So we don't want to just talk about what's not working, but we also want to highlight what is working, because that's part of policy changes to say like this hasn't worked. And so our, from the information we have through the literature and through the information we're collecting by people on the ground, these are the promising practices that need to be invested in. So we're looking to share these findings across nations and communities and those with lived experience, and inviting feedback from those around their recommendations to ensure that they're relevant and informative to the communities and to the nations. We have recently submitted a couple of research proposals to continue the work, because this is just really phase one. So we have a research proposal into CIHR, and received some funds, additional small amount of funds from my tax to keep the work going, which is allowing us to hire another research assistant to help in the second stage of the analysis, so that we can expand the work. And that brings me to questions. So I will, this is a QR code that just takes you to our website if you're interested. And that's my information if you're looking to speak with me more directly. So, miigwech.
Wow. Thank you so much for that, Brenda. I could not stop taking notes the whole time. Um, I've been really looking forward to this personally. I've been hearing a lot about the Realist review that you've been working on, and it's from, I'll just keep talking while we give the participants a few moments to collect their thoughts. And if they have any questions, again, just please enter those into the Q&A option of this Zoom webinar, and we will read those out and address those. And in the meantime, a few things that stood out to me. I really, really love this context, mechanism, outcome, the formula. That really speaks to me. And I think I'm going to use that insight like in a few areas of my life and see what happens there. So thank you for that little nugget. And there's two other things that I wanted to mention as well. One is the question. It seems a little ridiculous to me to have to ask this question, but how do we teach allies how to value Indigenous knowledges? Seems to be a really essential question that came up here.
Yeah.
And I know that by the term axiology, but that value system, you've helped me put it into words of how do we help allies learn how to value it, because there's evidence that there is a desire to,
Mhm.
but there seems to be a little lack of the know-how of what that looks like, what that means.
Mhm.
Uh,
Michael, I appreciate that comment, because, we're doing work in different areas. And one of the areas we've been doing some work on is in anti-Indigenous racism. And we've taken some of the information from here and created local context of communities being able to deliver information about not only colonial harms and how racism is experienced in our communities and what it does, but also about how communities can go and really raise up and highlight the work that they're doing and the knowledge that they bring, from a cultural lens and even from a clinical lens, because how we deliver clinical services even looks different. And when we did that and we brought it to mental health professionals, so psychologists and social workers in New Brunswick, where we were doing the work, those local communities, we identified frontline workers to do that sharing, to bring them to the communities. And we had a significantly positive response around their learning about what they didn't know happened in communities, and the amount of work and the amount of expertise that lives in communities, as well as, of course, the comments around, I didn't know how racism was experienced even in today and how it affected them. But I think that local context built up the power that we talk of, that this study shows around feeling empowered, feeling valued. But it also then allowed for the creation of relationships, so that partnership and collaboration piece, so that I'm hearing those, what we call them as mentors, are still talking to their mentees, the people that they were training, and bringing them to community and helping to identify areas of partnership. So I think part of learning is about being in partnership and being prepared to come in open-minded and flexible to learning something different, and that it can be done in a different way and be successful. So that's one of the things we found in our anti-Indigenous racism work that I think maps very nicely onto this research.
Yeah, it's incredible, and it ties into the next thing that really stood out to me was um, the suggestion to switch programming to not, I don't know if allow is the right term here, but and I forget which word you used, but having that time to connect back to community, um, it seems like it's another one of the fingers in that glove right there of
Mhm.
like I made a note here that says this work is creating a future where First Nations peoples won't have to go through the Western system for wellness, as you had mentioned, we currently do. We won't have to do that in the future for good medicine or for wellness for our community. We'll be able to do it in our ways, and that is enough. And that is so it's like I'm I'm fanboying over here.
I was really excited about that. It's been many years since I've been in a training environment, but it was exciting for me because it matched some of my experiences so long ago and what I heard in the roundtable about people saying like, I need to just get back to my community. I have to go back. So there was this importance about reconnecting, for to the community and to all that the community brings and back to your support system as a way of getting through a Western training modality and thinking about changing academic policies to give Indigenous people the ability to reconnect back. And when I think back, I was in I was in a clinical program at Queen's, and of course we all had to do a dissertation. I was the only one in my peer group, and this was at a different time, but I was the only one in my peer group who didn't choose something that meant I could collect data on campus. I actually went back into communities. And so I took the longest because I did more community-based research, which is way more common these days. And the pathway, I'm sure, is better than it was when I did it. But part of me doing that was because it was connection back to community, including my own, but like being back talking to people who had familiar terminologies and understandings as I did, right? So it made a difference. So I thought, okay, this is really interesting that this, it feels like common sense, the things that I think are in our hypotheses, very common sense, but things that until you put them in a realist review and say, these are the hypotheses and here's the information to support it, that then gives you enough leverage to create some policies or make policy recommendations that we can then take to government and perhaps training institutions or professional associations for them to consider.
Yeah, it's just incredible. So we have a question here. Someone has requested that you reshare your contact information.
Sure.
Um, and they say, Dr. Restoule, thank you for your share this AM and miigwech. But
Certainly.
to
I
your
don't
point,
think
I
I
do
can
agree
chat,
that
but oh, maybe I can. Maybe I can put it in. Yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
okay, beautiful. And yeah, to your point, it's for me, it keeps coming back to the values. It seems like such a basic thing, and a little ridiculous to have to go out and provide evidence for why we should be valued as humans. It seems a little outlandish, but thank you for doing the work because it has to be done. And again, it makes it so much easier for the next generation that hopefully won't have to go through the same struggles and won't have to
Mhm.
be telling the same stories that we have to tell. They'll be saying thank you to the ones that came before us and who made our lives so good. I don't know. I don't know the word there, but good. So if there's anything, Dr. Restoule, that you would like to add before we close out?
Actually, Michael, I see a second question, which I might have accidentally answered, not intending to. I was trying to put two things in.
Oh, I
Uh,
see. Yeah,
yeah,
it says, does Dr. Restoule have any guidance for students trying to enter in this area of study? Great question.
yeah, it is a great question. It's certainly been one of the things I've mulled over for a long time after I got past my trauma of being in grad school. um, a few things. I think as a student, one of the things we haven't done here in Canada very well, in if you are getting into the area of psychology at least, is we don't have a good network of support. So like there's Indigenous Physicians Association, Indigenous Nurses Associations, midwives, pharmacists. There's a whole bunch that have sort of been created. Of course, physicians and nurses have been around quite a long time, but pharmacists, midwives, and others have been coming up in the last 4 or 5 years and really have, it helps, I think, in an advocacy perspective. But for me, it helps in a network perspective. And psychologists, as Indigenous psychologists, we just haven't done that work to do it, not for lack of trying. Certainly, it was tried when I was a graduate student many, many, many moons ago, and didn't go anywhere. Probably mainly because of funding constraints, and you really need a champion to do it. So I think as a student, being able to get access to Indigenous psychologists is important. And if you don't know some, that makes it challenging. But I think being engaged in places like here, the Ontario Near, and others that have a whole section for graduate students to be able to support each other, to connect with each other, to learn about those that are in this profession, whether they be in the academic research and how to support there, or those who are more like me and ended up more in a community-based setting, and how do you work in a community-based setting. So I think having a network of supports by other graduate students, and then having a network of support by those who've gone through the training programs can be helpful. I think there's a need to advocate quite strongly for an Indigenous specific body. I know CPA has their Indigenous people section, and I'm seeing over the years as I watch from afar, more Indigenous people are taking ownership of that space, which they weren't before. But I'm not sure that having them in a colonial institution is the best space. Like, I think we do need our own space separately. So as students, I think the ability to network and get support, but secondly, for me, is having a really strong community-based network. So it doesn't just have to be psychologists. For me, some of my work and helping me to feel valued was finding other systems. So I did Native Mental Health Association, which we've now sort of melded into First People's Wellness Circle. So where I heard people talking about the realities of where I was living and planned to work was extremely beneficial to me. And then the second was connection to cultural practitioners. So Clay and I, we worked together before, and it was very valuable to work with his mother, Pauline Ba, and getting their insights about how we do the work in our communities made it possible for me for that survival piece of our hypotheses that I mentioned. So I think making the connections to those community-based workers, whether they're cultural practitioners or otherwise, can also help us in doing this work. Yeah, those are my thoughts. And
I love that so much, and I hope that that did answer the question. Um, we do have another question here as well. Someone has asked, given the meta crisis the world is in, witnessing the end of modernity, as it were, should Indigenous values not be in a leadership position rather than trying to fit in with the colonial ways of thinking? And they've followed up and said that the Academy should be looking to Indigenous people for guidance.
yeah, I would say very simply, our elders and our thought leaders have indicated to us that much of our knowledge and the evidence that we have is something that will lead not just Indigenous people to a place of wellness, but it is very much grounded in humanness and connection and spirit. And those are things that have been missing, I think, whether it be in academies or in healthcare systems. And until we get back to that, we are not going to be able to resolve some of these complex issues in our community, in our countries and in our nations, not just in our own communities. So yeah, I would agree with you. I think we need to be in leadership positions. I think we need to be recognized as being not only able to self determine our own way forward, but that what we can learn in our self-determining can have value in other contexts. So I would agree with you.
100%. So we're getting close to time now. So if there are no other questions, again, Dr. Restoule, I'd like to invite you if you have any further comments before we do close out.
Um, I think, you know, you've all had an opportunity to see this presentation. We are quite interested in hearing about the hypothesis we've come to. Do they have relevance? Are they meaningful in your work? And are there things that you can point us to help us think further and to sort of further refine our hypothesis to help us in policy recommendations. So if there's anything that you think you would like to contribute, please reach out. I will certainly review what you have to share and bring it back to some of our people who are doing sort of the frontline work on the research. I'm more of a director piece on that, but I would bring it back to Ryan and Emily and others who are doing that work. And we had the opportunity to present at an international realist review conference a couple of months ago when we got some really great feedback. So we are like on a path to just continuing this work and could use people's insights and connections, whether it's to community or workforce or to your own lived experiences, something we'd like to know about. So thanks so much.
Amazing. So miigwech, everybody, and just a little reminder that the survey will pop up when this webinar ends. So please take the time to fill that out so we can improve moving forward. And again, kiichi miigwech, Dr. Restoule, for bringing these good teachings our way and for taking the time to share them with us and to answer these questions for us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me, miigwech.
Absolutely. So again, thank you, everybody, and hope to see you at the next webinar.